Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue our deep dive into the MCU with Phase 2. I would dare say that Phase 1 isn't actually as good as I remember it to be. But hey, Phase 2 has to be the turning point for these movies, right? This is where they actually get good. I mean, I remember my favorite movies here. This is the era where supposedly Marvel started finding its footing. They started to take more risks and they started to dig a little bit deeper into the characters. So let's not waste any time and let's just talk about Iron Man 3. So when Iron Man 3 first came out, I didn't really like it. But upon rewatching it, I've come to appreciate it a lot more. It's a much better movie than I initially gave it credit for, and it does something really interesting with Tony's character. It actually explores it. You see, this isn't just a superhero movie, it's a story about Tony's humanity. He feels actually real here. He struggles with anxiety, PTSD, and after the events of the Avengers, he's pretty much fucked. It's honestly a side of him that we hadn't seen before, and it sets up his arc perfectly for the rest of the entirety of the MCU that leads all the way up to Age of Ultron and Endgame. In relation to the characters, I am bummed out that we honestly don't really get more Happy in this movie. He's truly one of the best human characters in the MCU, like purely human, no superpowers. But I completely understand what they were going for by writing him out of the story. And sadly, the rest of the character dynamics are just more of the same. I honestly believe that they nailed Rhodey and Tony in this one. I would say that they honestly feel like friends. And the relationship that they establish between Tony and Harley is honestly great. It doesn't work as just comic relief, but it also shows Tony's softer side that we don't really get to see that much, and how he actually tries to manage his anxiety by focusing on helping others while also accepting the help of others, which is something that Tony Stark truly needed as a character arc. One of the best things about this movie, and my favorite thing about it, it's how it strips Tony down. He can't really rely on his millions of dollars or his super suit for most of the film. Instead, we see him actually using his ingenuity in creative ways, which is basically his superpower. It's not the suit, it's the fact that he's a genius. In this movie, he's kind of like my giver. He finds his way out of situations with duct tape, spare parts, and really creatively. It's honestly very refreshing to see Tony being brought down a peg, and the action direction is a lot of fun because of it. Now, that is not to say that there are no Iron Man moments in this movie. I mean, the scene where he saves people falling from a plane is as good Iron Man action as it gets for me. I love seeing superheroes saving people, just my thing, so it does get extra points for that. And on top of that, the final fight, conceptually extremely entertaining. Tony mobilizing the Iron Legion, hopping between suits as they get completely destroyed, is extremely creative and chaotic, and it's actually very satisfying. Also, I know that it pissed off a lot of people, but I'm 100% okay with Pepper being the one to take down Killian in this. It's a nice twist, and it works because the movie builds her up as someone who Tony needs to protect no matter what. But she turns it around and shows Tony that sometimes he needs protecting, sometimes he needs help, and he cannot do it all alone. And that works with the themes of this movie. Now, along the same lines, I know the Mandarin twist pissed off a lot of people. A lot of people hate it, but honestly, I think it works in the scope of the movie. The whole movie sets you up to see that Killian is actually the bad guy with his goons. And the twist doesn't really feel cheap because of that. Now, that being said, I do wish that Killian had been working for the real Mandarin all along when setting this whole thing up, instead of just framing it the other way around. This is all because the build up to the Mandarin as a concept, as a character, was actually good, and it feels like a missed opportunity not to have him as a mastermind sort of character for an overarching story down the line, working in the background. It still doesn't ruin the movie for me, but I would have liked a little bit to show that, hey, the Mandarin is actually real, we don't know who he is, but he exists and he is here. There's one thing I really don't like about this movie, and that's Tony's ex. Her character is honestly all over the place, and it doesn't make sense for her to show up right before the attack if she's one of the bad guys. And Tony not letting Pepper leave during this feels extremely out of character. I thought you needed to protect her, bro. Why do you have her stay while you gave your address to terrorists? Also, Maya's constant flip-flopping between being good and bad is really confusing because it doesn't really get time. Is she a villain? Is she a redeemable character? Who knows? And by the time that you actually think about it, she's already dead. It is honestly one part of the movie that feels messy and underdeveloped. But overall, Iron Man 3 is honestly a pretty solid entry into the MCU and a great start to Phase 2. It's well directed, the pacing is light, it gives Tony Stark a lot of depth, and I really like that after this movie, Tony actually becomes a more private person, or at least it feels that way. Like he actually learned his lesson of, maybe I shouldn't give my home address to terrorists. What I mean by this is that we don't really see much of his personal life again until really Endgame. And honestly, I think this could have been the perfect ending for Tony as Iron Man. Blowing up the suits and removing the arc reaction. Full closure for the character. If he had actually retired as a superhero after this, it would have honestly been a satisfying conclusion. But honestly, I'm not really mad that we did get more of him. Problem is, like, now Tony felt like a little bit too invincible, too strong in the movies after this. So Iron Man 3 is actually worth the watch. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than people give it credit for online. Okay, now let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about Thor: The Dark World. And I'll be honest with you, this movie's boring, man. It's actually unbearable. It honestly took me 3 whole days to watch it. And this movie alone is the main reason why this video took so long to come out. I just couldn't sit through it in one sitting. I had to take breaks, which is crazy when you think about it for one movie. And that is because this movie is a mess. It starts with this weird, disembodied narration dumping a bunch of exposition about the Dark Elves, the Aether, and some ancient war. And honestly, it doesn't work. If your movie needs to explain its entire premise in a voiceover before anything happens at all, you've already lost me. Especially if it's a sequel to an already established character. Like, what are we doing here? Also, the pacing of this movie doesn't help either. It's all over the place. Some scenes drag forever while others feel rushed. Like, the movie can't truly decide what's important, and honestly, it shows. And here's the thing, when you really think about it, this movie makes no sense as part of the bigger MCU narrative. It takes place on Earth, right? So, where the fuck are the Avengers? Or S.H.I.E.L.D.? The Dark Elves are literally invading London, and not a single Avenger shows up. Not even a cameo, not even an explanation as to why. I mean, come on, man. Honestly, the Earth stuff is what ruins this movie. Jane Foster is just there as a walking MacGuffin. She's unnecessary and feels like a plot device to utilize the ether and make us care about it, but she's not really a character. On top of that, we also got Darcy back for some reason, and now we also got another useless character for really bad comic relief. Like, come on, man. Please, stop. The Earth's subplots are so unnecessary in this movie, and honestly, it drags the whole thing down. Honestly, this movie would have been great, way better, if we had just stayed in Asgard. And I know that I said that in the first one, Asgard was ugly as shit, and I meant it, because in this movie, Asgard looks awesome. The world building here is one of the few things that the movie gets right. The sets, the costumes, the lore, it all looks great and adds depth to Thor's world and lore. Another big positive is Loki. He's the best part of the movie. We all know that Tom Hiddleston is an amazing actor, and he brings so much complexity to the character. The dynamic between Thor and Loki is also fantastic. Like, honestly, those are the 3 things that I really like about this movie. And this dynamic is what was actually missing from the first movie. Their scenes together, whether they're bickering, teaming up, betraying each other, fighting, arguing. Those are the highlights of the film. the character worked. But sadly, not even Loki can save this mess. And that is because, once again, we got a one-off empty villain. So let's talk about Malekith. Or rather, let's not. Because he's the most boring, generic villain in the MCU so far. All we know about him is that he's a dark elf who wants to destroy the universe. Because of reasons? There's just no depth, no motivation, no charisma. He's just the bad guy because the script says so. And the ether is supposed to be this big, dangerous thing, but the movie doesn't really do anything interesting with it either. This is our second Infinity Stone, and it didn't do anything. By the end, it's just there, left unfinished and unexplained in a post-credit scene, like that is supposed to mean anything to us. Yes, it sets up Guardians of the Galaxy, but you don't really know that. But hey, it's a dumb action superhero movie, right? Well, yes, but the action doesn't help either. The choreography is boring as hell, with the exception of the portal hopping sequence during the final battle. That one is good and creative, but one scene doesn't save a whole generic CGI mess of a movie. Dark elves shooting lasers, Thor swinging his hammer. It's all stuff that we've seen before, and it's honestly exhausting and not exciting whatsoever. But if there is one thing that I really hate, and it took me out of the movie entirely, it's that Loki gets a second fake out death scene. We already got one in the first movie, and it was fine. But doing it again here feels just cheap. If they hadn't done it in the first movie, this one actually would have had impact and relevance. But no, Loki dies, and then surprise, he's alive at the end, pretending to be Odin. Except, wait, where is Odin? No, seriously, what happened to him? The movie doesn't bother to explain it, and when you think about it for longer than 2 seconds, it doesn't make sense. Like, what the fuck? So yeah, Thor: The Dark World almost works. The Asgard world building is cool, Loki is great, and the Thor-Loki dynamic is fantastic. But it's held back by dumb, unnecessary Earth subplots, a terrible villain with no motivation, and really boring action. Don't get me wrong, it's better than Thor 1, at least this one doesn't have a bunch of Dutch angles, but honestly that's not saying much. It's still really bad, and it's easily the second worst movie in the MCU, and the weakest part of Phase 2. Now, let's move on to a movie that I actually remember liking. In fact, it's probably my favorite MCU movie of this era, and it only got dethroned by Infinity War when that came out. Yes, I know, I am biased, but Captain America and the Winter Soldier is honestly awesome. Like, actually awesome. It's not just a superhero movie, it's actually an action spy thriller disguised as a Captain America movie. And honestly, it works really well. Like, Steve Rogers himself, this movie gives us so much more exploration of the character. And that's honestly when it's at its best. His values, his convictions, and how he struggles to fit into the modern world. Plus, this movie makes Cap feel like an actual badass. Like, the elevator fight scene alone and the escape from S.H.I.E.L.D. right after are some of the best action sequences in the MCU so far. The build-up, the framing, the choreography, the action direction, everything is top tier. And that speech that Steve gives about freedom versus fear to the S.H.I.E.L.D. employees, it gives me chills every single time. This is the Captain America story I wanted, and I'm so happy that I got it. I also really love how this movie handles the supporting characters. I've never really liked Sam Wilson, but he is way better than in later movies. He's got a good dynamic with Steve, and his introduction actually provides good characterization for him. And the movie does a great job establishing the dynamic between these two, which ends up being the core for Sam's character for the remainder of the MCU up to his own movie. Black Widow is actually pretty good too. Her friendship with Steve is one of the best parts of the movie. I actually love that they didn't really force a romance between them. Instead, we just get this dynamic where Natasha's trying to redeem herself and live up to what Steve represents. It's honestly refreshing, and it adds much needed depth to her character, which we haven't really gotten so far. Like, honestly, this whole movie and characters center around their dynamic and relationships with Steve Rogers. And the focus point of the movie is certainly Bucky. Because, oh man, the Winter Soldier is truly a compelling antagonist. He's a tortured soul, but also a force to be reckoned with. The fact that Steve is willing to give up everything to save his best friend is so emotionally charged. And I honestly love that the movie doesn't bother with tying up Bucky's story with a neat little bow. He's left as a loose end. And it works because of the implications for the future. Plus, the fact that Steve kinda gets his ass kicked by Bucky is a great way to show that Bucky is just as strong, if not stronger, thanks to whatever version of the serum he's got. But it also shows, in a certain way, that Cap was kind of holding back. Nick Fury is another standout character here. This is easily his best MCU appearance, and I know I just talked about how much I disliked Loki's fake-out death, but the fake-out death for Nick Fury actually works because the movie sells you on it. It services the plot in a meaningful way. Plus, his dynamic with Steve and the whole trust no one vibe adds so much tension to the story, and I love that. And speaking of the story itself, the pacing is fantastic. The movie sets up the government infiltration from the very beginning, and it all feels so well thought out. Project Insight honestly makes total sense as something that the American government would develop in response to a global threat. And the reveal of Alexander Pierce as the real villain and Hydra's infiltration of S.H.I.E.L.D., it's perfectly executed. The movie takes its time to develop these threats, and it honestly pays off in a big way. Another thing that I really like is the tone of the movie. Like, the movie doesn't really rely on the usual MCU quippy comedy. There are some moments of levity, yes, but they're minor, and they actually add to the character dynamics instead of feeling like, I don't know, out of place, dumb, one-liner superhero movie shit. This movie is a spy thriller at its core, but it still has some dumb superhero shit. But it's not any dumb superhero shit, it's the good shit. Like, for example, when Cap takes down a Quinjet with his fucking shield, it's great, it's entertaining, it's dumb, it's amazing in the best way possible. Now, upon rewatch, I do have a couple things I do not like. First of all, the scene where Bucky attacks Fury, and in order to escape, Fury makes, and I shit you not, a Bugs Bunny style hole in the ground. Yeah, that's fucking dumb, and it honestly takes me out of the movie so quickly every single time. Another thing I don't like is honestly Steve's motivation, particularly his motivation to doubt the government. It kind of feels a little forced. Sure, there's the whole S.H.I.E.L.D. is compromised thing, but Cap doesn't really know this. He has no reason to distrust Fury at the beginning of the movie. They brought him back. He helped them save New York, and that's kind of it. The boat scene is suspicious, sure, but as the only example of distrusting S.H.I.E.L.D. and Fury and the government, it's honestly not enough to fully sell his motivation. I don't know, maybe it's just me. And the last thing I really hate is that I wish Steve didn't hang out with old Peggy. Think about it for a second. Like, if Peggy, Howard Stark, and basically everyone that he knew back in the day were actually dead, it would make the connection between him and Bucky that much deeper and meaningful. But honestly, like, those are really minor complaints, and this movie is still one of my favorites in the MCU. It runs a little longer, yes, but as I said, they took their time and they didn't rush it. The Winter Soldier has a really tight plot, great characters, and a tone that balances grounded spy thriller with superhero spectacle. And honestly, it's really well executed. No wonder the Russo brothers kept getting brought back after this. They actually nailed it. And speaking of nailing it, Guardians of the Galaxy is a rare animal. It actually surprised me that it intentionally opens like a real movie. You know, no logos, no nothing. Just a really strong emotional gut punch. Young Peter Quill losing his mom to cancer. And then, out of nowhere, boom, you got logos, and you remember, oh, hey, right, this is a comic book movie. I should probably stop crying. And this movie kind of does comic book better than most. We're thrown into this wild, colorful space opera, and let's be honest here, no one really expected a Marvel movie about a bunch of cosmic misfits to actually work. Like, yeah, maybe you knew Rocket Raccoon from Marvel vs. Capcom, but that's probably it. If you weren't a hardcore comic book guy at the time, chances are you had no idea who these guys were. And honestly, that works for the benefit of this movie, because none of these characters in the comic books are anything like the movie. And James Gunn made it work, and he made himself a household name in the process. Because this movie is honestly a masterclass in tone. It balances heartfelt moments with over-the-top comedy and action, and honestly, let's not forget the music. The awesome mixtape is iconic. How many views does it have on YouTube again? Hell, even I was using it as a background music on my streams on Twitch. That is because the Walkman and the music are not just gimmicks. And I personally dislike it when licensed music is overused in movies. However, in this case, it makes sense because they're actually central to Peter's character and the movie's identity on its own. This is licensed music utilized to flesh out the character and service the story, and that's the best way to use it. Oh, and speaking of Peter Quill, I love how the movie frames his character to begin with. It starts with him pretending to be this gritty Han Solo type rogue character, but within seconds we actually see that he's just a goofy guy. He's just trying to have fun. It's honestly such a great way to introduce the character, and it sets the tone for the whole movie. This isn't your typical serious sci-fi flick. It's actually a fun, self-aware space adventure, and the movie itself knows exactly what it is. And it's not just Peter, the rest of the Guardians are actually just as fun. The arrest and processing scene is actually a perfect way to introduce the team to us. You got Gamora, the deadliest woman in the galaxy, as they call it, who's trying to escape her past as Thanos' loyal daughter. And I'll admit it, her turn against Thanos feels a little bit forced. Like, she's actually her dad's favorite, the best soldier, and she's just been waiting to turn on him? What? It's actually a bit shaky, but it kind of works for the story. Then there's Rocket and Groot, who are actually a perfect duo. Rocket's sarcastic, angry raccoon energy pairs perfectly with Groot's gentle, quite literal mindlessness. Their dynamic is one of the best parts of the movie, and Groot is surprisingly deep as a character once you think about it. And speaking of deep characters, we also got Drax, who is actually hilarious. He has a literal way of speaking, but he also gets some surprisingly subtle character moments. At the time, I was actually surprised that this Batista is the same Batista I saw for years in WWE. Now, the villain is where things get actually interesting. From a writing perspective, that is. Because Ronan is your classic one-note bad guy. Super serious, super evil, super generic. Just like past villains so far in the MCU. But here's the thing. This time, it works. Because the movie intentionally frames him as this over-the-top grim and gray villain to contrast with the Guardians' colorful, chaotic energy. Hell, even his monologue at the end is literally interrupted by Peter singing and dancing. And it's actually perfect. It's the movie saying, yeah, we know he's ridiculously serious and generic, and we're actually having fun with it. Yondu is another subtle standout character. The movie sets him up as this cold-blooded space pirate, but the movie kinda subtly hints at a softer side and his connection to Peter, and it's actually a great setup for his character arc in the next movie. Also, he gets one of the most badass scenes so far. Nebula is another character who also gets some solid groundwork here. Her rivalry with Gamora and her desperation to prove herself to Thanos makes her one of the more compelling side characters in the MCU so far, and by far the most complex female character. The world building in this movie is another massive highlight. The movie doesn't waste time over explaining things. You know, Xandar, the Nova Corps, the Kree, they're just there, and you're expected to roll with it. It reminds me of Star Wars in the best of ways. We don't waste time doing needless exposition, just gotta take it as matter of fact. This is our world, and that's it. It's great, and it feels like the movie it's actually respecting the audience. We also get the official build-up to Thanos as the big bad MCU guy lurking in the background, and it's honestly great. Josh Brolin's voice is perfect, even if the old CGI design looks like shit. I'm actually happy that they fixed that. The explanation of the Infinity Stones is also handled amazingly, especially if you're watching the movies chronologically and already know about the ether from Thor Dark World. And unlike other Marvel movies, it's not just a MacGuffin, it's actually the driving force of the plot. Everything revolves around it. And the conflict is actually resolved by using the stone, which is actually set up earlier in this exposition scene. It's smart by the book storytelling, and yet again, another awesome thing that this movie pulls off. Now, this movie is great. Yes, but my favorite thing about this movie is how the Guardians feel like a D&D party. Each character has their own unique quirks, flaws, and their dynamic feels like something a real group of friends would come up with while playing D&D. You know, the arguing, the bonding, the creating crazy plans that go awry in the end. They're just extremely fun to watch. Now, I do have a couple of nitpicks, because of course I do. Groot's sacrifice is yet another fake-out death scene. We are 4 for 4 in Phase 2, and we're not stopping there. But at least this time, the fake-out death scene, similarly as the last one, it services the plot and has a reason behind it with real consequence, you could say. And while Ronan does work as a villain, he's still a one-dimensional bad guy. But to be honest, those are just minor complaints in what is otherwise a near-perfect movie. Guardians of the Galaxy is a wild, fun ride with actual heart, humor, and some of the best character dynamics in the whole of the MCU. It's proof that Marvel can take risks, and those risks tend to work. If anything, the stuff that doesn't work is the generic shit they've tried so far. And speaking of generic shit, alright, let's start with the good. Because while I don't particularly like this movie, it is not the worst movie ever made. So there's still some good things. Like, the opening scene is actually great. The Avengers storming a Hydra base, kicking ass, and working together as a team, awesome. And exactly the way that I needed to open this movie, and what you would expect to watch an Avengers movie. Another good thing, and personally my favorite part of the movie, is when the Avengers are just hanging out. You know, when they're at the party, trying to lift Thor's hammer, drinking and chilling, and just being themselves. It's a rare moment where the characters actually feel like real people, not just superheroes. The banter between them is great, the chemistry is there, and it's a reminder of why we actually like these characters. But one good scene is not enough to make a good movie. And it's a shame because, honestly, I would just watch a whole movie of this one scene. just these guys hanging out, talking, and reminiscing about past adventures would be great. Another scene that I thought was fun was the Hulkbuster scene and the whole implication of Tony and his anxieties having contingency plans just in case. Actually, I kind of like that because it leads to fun things. And that's what these movies should be. They should be fun. But sadly, it doesn't matter if in these scenes the action direction is tight or the banter is fun, or if these scenes being scattered through the movie almost tricks you into thinking that the movie is good. Because that's the thing I have the biggest issue with in this movie. The movie has some good stuff, but that good stuff is sprinkled through the experience. And sadly, this good stuff, these good things, are not actually related to the main things happening through the movie. So it's not enough. The movie is honestly too long and too boring. Once the initial excitement from the trailers and the intro wears off, Age of Ultron falls apart pretty quickly. The pacing is all over the place. The movie is crammed with so many subplots, setups, and characters that it feels like a bloated mess. It's trying to do way too much, and as a result, it does almost everything poorly. Like, for example, the quote-unquote humor. There's way too many jokes in this movie. It feels like every other line is a quip, and most of them don't even land. It's like Joss Whedon forgot how to balance humor and drama. For example, Ultron, the villain who is supposed to be a world-ending, terrifying AI, is actually cracking jokes left and right. The Pinocchio parallel does not work because we don't see him being used as a puppet at first. So it's actually hard to take him seriously when he's making bad jokes and whining about being strings attached. The strings are not attached to anything anymore. What does that even mean, bro? You're not a real character. On the same note, the action, while visually impressive and technically having world-ending stakes, at no point do I feel like the Avengers are actually gonna lose. And the movie itself doesn't help either. Once again, we're stuck with a faceless army of robots for the Avengers to punch. And sure, Ultron gets some characterization, arguably too much, but his army is still boring CGI cannon fodder. The final battle in Sokovia is a mess because you can't really tell what's happening half of the time, and again, it has no real tension or emotional weight because these guys are just making jokes the whole time while they fight. Like, how am I supposed to take this serious? Even Quicksilver's death feels cheap and unearned. He's barely in the movie, so his sacrifice doesn't really mean much. Speaking of Quicksilver, the twins are honestly an interesting concept, don't get me wrong. But I don't think they're used well. Wanda gets some decent screen time and some characterization with Hawkeye, yes, but Quicksilver gets the short end of the stick. If they knew they were going to kill him off because they couldn't use them because of the Fox rights, why even include him in the first place? And another thing that doesn't make sense to me is Wanda's induced vision that leads Tony into creating Ultron. Like, what was even the point of that? She looks all smug like, all according to plan. But it makes no sense. What was her plan? Why would you do that? Did you want him to create an even bigger threat? It's honestly never explained, and it's just frustrating. Also, what's up with this footage? It's just weird, and it's never used again. Like, it feels extremely out of place, like you didn't need to do that. That is some amateur shit right there. Now, on the bright side, we do get some much needed characterization for Hawkeye. His secret family and farm are actually a really nice touch. And it's good to see him get some depth after being sidelined for the first movie. And while I don't like Joss Whedon, I'll give credit where it's due. Bruce Banner gets a lot of extra characterization here. You can tell when a director actually likes a specific character, and Whedon does a lot to give Banner some depth in both Avengers movies. It's actually a shame that later movies just kind of grab this and throw it all away. But here's the thing, like, I wouldn't say Age of Ultron is a bad movie. It does what a movie should do. It has action, character moments, and a working plot to a certain degree. But it does all of them mediocrely, almost poorly. The pacing is off, the humor is forced, the stakes feel low and non-existent at times. For a movie called Age of Ultron, it's more like Week of Ultron or a few days of Ultron. It's not what I was expecting, and it's definitely not what such an iconic character deserves. If anything, at least hint at him still being there lurking in the background. It just feels like a waste, especially since if you know a little bit about the comics, you know that Tony didn't create Ultron, it was actually Hank Pym. And at the time, we actually knew that the next movie coming out was Ant-Man. So why oh why would Disney choose to change the character so much? Honestly, beats me. Well, maybe it's because Ant-Man is the definition of a nothing movie. It's not terrible, but it's not good either. It's just there. It's the kind of movie you watch once, forget about it, and then wonder why it even existed in this narrative. I mean, it's not offensively bad, but it's not memorable either. It's just fine. It's just there to introduce the concept of the quantum realm. And that's it. The plot of the movie is painfully generic. It's your standard reluctant hero learns to be a hero, but with ants. Scott Lang is a thief who gets recruited by Hank Pym to steal a Shinkin suit to stop Darren Cross, aka Yellow Jacket, from selling the technology to bad guys. That's it. There's no real stakes, no real tension, and no real surprise. It's all predictable. Within 20 minutes, you can pretty much guess what's going to happen the whole movie. And speaking of Scott Lang, Paul Rudd, charming as always. But even he cannot save this movie. Because Scott's arc is so basic. Deadbeat dad who wants to be a better father for his daughter, and stealing stuff somehow makes that happen? Like, it's not that the story's bad, it's just that it's been done like a million times before, and this movie doesn't really add anything new to it. The whole I need to prove myself to my daughter feels kind of tacked on, like forced. The writers were kind of checking off boxes of emotional depth, it seems. I actually wish this movie would have been about something else. Oh, I don't know, maybe creating Ultron or some shit. Because yes, once again, we got a nothing villain. Darren Cross is one of the worst and most forgettable villains in the MCU so far. In fact, he's actually the laziest villain. Because when you take a second and think about it, he's just Obadiah Stane all over again. Quite literally. Generic evil businessman with no real motivation other than I want money and power. I'm taking over the company and building and selling weapons. There's no depth, no charisma. Nothing makes him stand out. Even his yellow jacket suit is just a bigger, meaner version of the Ant-Man suit. I wonder where we have seen this. And the supporting characters aren't that much better either. Hank Pym is just there to explain the science and be grumpy. Hope Van Dyne is extremely underused. She's clearly more capable than Scott, but she spends the movie sidelined for literally no reason. It's honestly frustrating because Hope is one of the few good female characters we've gotten so far, but no, we won't use her because of reasons. And don't even get me started on Luis and his crew. Sure, Michael Peña's rapid-fire storytelling is funny, but only the first time that you watch it. It's actually exhausting on multiple viewings. The rest of the crew, just there for comic relief. zero weight to the story, and not really that funny. The action itself is fine. The shrinking effect is fine. And there's a few creative moments, like, for example, the Thomas the Tank Engine fight. But for the most part, the action is just okay. It's not bad, but it's not good either. The final fight between Ant-Man and Yellow Jacket is just two guys in suits punching each other, but smaller. It's kind of creative with the set piece, but it's not really groundbreaking. The one thing that Ant-Man does have going for it, it's the tone. It's consistent. Like, it's light, and yeah, sure, it's fun. Doesn't take itself too seriously. But that's kind of the problem. The movie is so focused on being fun, quirky comedy that it forgets to be interesting. There's no real depth, no real stakes, and no real reason to care about what's happening. It's like the movie is afraid to commit to something. It's not a full-on comedy, but it's not a serious superhero movie, and it's not even a real heist movie. It's just fine. And the movie tries so hard to tie itself to the larger universe, but it's so forced. The Falcon cameo, sure, is fun, but it doesn't really add anything to the story. The whole "this technology is dangerous and could change the world" thing is undercut by the fact that we've already seen way crazier technology changing the world. Like, you know, Ultron, which was the easiest way to actually make this movie feel important. But it's hard to take these stakes seriously when you know the Avengers are out there dealing with shit that it's way more important and way bigger and way more advanced. In the end, Ant-Man is what I would call a nothing movie. It's not bad, but it's not good either. It's just fine. And fine is sadly what we have gotten the most out of all of these movies. But all of those fine movies were about characters we already know. Characters that are famous on name alone. We need something good for a new character. Something to latch onto. But no. This is the kind of movie you watch when you forget to stop the autoplay. And then you forget about it as soon as it's over. Why? Because it's fine. It's not the worst MCU movie, but it's definitely the most fine one so far. So, when I first started this series, I was truly hoping to have a blast. You know, revisiting old movies that I remember fondly. But having done it so far, I can't help but wonder, why did we even like these? Like, don't get me wrong, there are some great movies in here. Iron Man 3, Captain America 2, and Guardians 1, amazing movies. Yes, but it doesn't take away from the fact that most of the MCU movies so far have actually been stinkers. Or, you know, straight up nothing fine movies. And when you think about it, that's kind of disappointing. So yes, I have already answered the question posed at the beginning of the first video. These movies were carried by Hollywood and rabid fan bases. The blockbuster effect. And most of the MCU is not bad, but I would say that being mid is even worse, which is what it is. However, the good ones are really fucking good. You know, good enough to keep this whole thing afloat, it seems. So, what changed? When did we turn away from it? And when did we stop being okay with mid movies? Well, we won't know for sure until I finish watching Phase 3. So, you know, you can hit that like button to know when that video comes out. And in the meantime, feel free to check some of my other videos. You might actually find something you like. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.